Pacers lose twice this weekend, locking up top 6 lottery odds. An interesting weekend playing Tyrese Haliburton was unbelievable. Isaiah Jackson returned to the floor and looked very good in his 2 games. Terry Taylor had a nice weekend. We'll break down the weekend that was, standings watch, and Isaiah Jackson's return, all on today's Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and the West Side Community News. And today, we're talking about the weekend that was, with Isaiah Jackson returning to the Pacers lineup for the first time in a few weeks and playing well. Tyrese Haliburton having 2 historic games. Terry Taylor playing well. Goga Bitadze playing well. A lot of good performances from the Pacers in general, but their defense still stunk in a way that allowed them to lose twice. So good standings weekend in the inverse standings race for the Pacers. They are now locked up a top 6 lottery odds position and a top 10 pick. We'll talk about that at the end as we do standings watch every Monday for the rest of the season. And in the middle, talking about Isaiah Jackson and his return. He looked good. He said some interesting stuff after this Detroit game. That just happened a few hours ago. So lots to get to today after 2 games of absence from this podcasting games. Pacers played twice, losing to the Celtics 128-123, losing to Detroit 121-117. Pacers love the close losses this season, as has been well documented. And look, there are a lot of things that went well this weekend. I'll talk about all of them. O'Shea Brissett played well. Goga played well. Jalen Smith and Lance had good games. In one of the games, Terry Taylor had one good game. None of that is really important. Tyrese Haliburton is what's important for the Pacers this year and next year and for seasons going on and on and on. And Tyrese Haliburton just had an unbelievably good weekend of basketball. The Pacers went into Boston with another banged-up team like they've had all season, and Haliburton starting. And Haliburton played 25 minutes this game because he fouled out, and 2 of them were, you don't have to blow the whistle kind of fouls, and which always sucks. I mean, they were fouls, but they shouldn't have had the whistle blown. Whatever. In Boston, Tyrese Haliburton had 30 points, which sounds like, okay, a pretty good game. He took 11 shots to do it, made all of his threes, made all of his free throws, only 2 turnovers, 3 steals. He was ridiculous. He was all of the Pacers' offense when he was in the game. He could not be stopped. He was getting all the way to the basket for his layups. This has been well documented as a big thing for him. His range was anywhere on the court. He took some deep, deep threes. He was setting up his teammates well. His defense was good. He was in the passing lanes. The Celtics ended up with 15 turnovers. He was a big part of that. His offensive output that night was unbelievable. I mean, he was off the charts good. The Celtics could not stop him at all, and the Pacers were playing very well with him in the game. And unfortunately, he fouled out, or else this weekend would have looked even better for him. Oh, well. Not to be outdone, the very next game, 2 days later, against the Detroit Pistons, Pacers losing by 4, not Tyrese Haliburton's fault. They win his minutes by 2 points. He has 19 points on 6 of 13 from the field, and he missed all his threes, so he was excellent inside the arc. 7 for 8 from the free throw line, 9 rebounds, 17 assists. That ties a career high. 1 rebound away from his first ever triple-double. It was his second best rebounding night of his career. So 19, 9, and 17 to follow up a 30-point performance where he only missed 1 shot. Tyrese Haliburton was ridiculous. And let's put into context how good a 17-assist game is, because I haven't even said the best part of it. 0 turnovers in the Detroit game for Haliburton. 17 assists, 0 turnovers. That has been done 12 times since 2000. In this century, since it started, that has been done 12 times. Tyrese Haliburton was just the first guy to do it since LeBron James back in 2018. The list of guys who've done it in this century are like LeBron, Chris Paul, Rajon Rondo. It's very, very rare. He was insanely good this weekend, Tyrese Haliburton was. And some of it, he just credits his teammates for making shots. But to me, and as has been, I think, written about by probably everyone on the Pacers beat, or everyone who attends all the games and covers the team in some capacity, is he looked more aggressive, right? He was willing to blow by his guys and make stuff happen, as opposed to being a little more settling or deferring to his teammates on the perimeter. And there are times for that. He's still figuring out the perfect balance. But he was really aggressive in getting stuff going and being the initiator in these games. And not only did he play well, obviously his stats speak for themselves, but it made the Pacers better when he was out there too. And Rick Carlisle talked about after the Pistons game that something they're really working on as a team is, it used to be, and he even mentioned this, early in the season when the Pacers would get defensive rebounds, basically whoever got it was pushing up in transition, outside of like Miles Turner, basically. Sabonis would push, LeVert would push, Brogdon would push. Whoever got the rebound, usually, unless there was a really obvious good pass ahead, would push themselves. They would dribble the floor. Now it is, hey, you get the rebound, get Tyrese Haliburton the ball in transition, because that guy is going to carve up the court and find open teammates or find good shots or make stuff happen. And so that is where, that they're finding that aggressiveness. And so the Pacers, 9 steals against Boston is excellent. Against the Pistons, they only had 6, but they're forcing a lot more misses, at least inside the arc. The Pistons shot extremely well from 3, but terrible from 2, right? So they had these transition opportunities still to allow them to be a better team and allow Tyrese Haliburton to be some of the best version of himself. The fast break points don't necessarily bear it out, but that is where they're getting out ahead of the other teams. They had 25 fast break points against Detroit, right? So that those transition opportunities are something that is really helping them be better and really helping Haliburton be better. And his aggressiveness combined with that made him look like an unbelievable player this weekend. And it's not going to happen because he's only been on the team for basically a month and a half now, which is crazy to think about. But as you see these crazy numbers in the passing department, it's not a lock, but it's pretty close that Tyrese Haliburton is going to set the Pacers assist record next season, but probably per game and definitely total, right? With the Pacers so far this year, in only 23 games, okay, I only have the first 22 on Basketball Reference, 208 assists for Haliburton, 9.5 per game. The Pacers franchise record for a full season was Mark Jackson with 713, right? So Haliburton is getting about to 40% of the way to that in only 20-something games. So that will be close to the total number. And then the per game, Mark Jackson, 8.7 per game is the franchise record. He's well over that at 9.5. So it's very, very, very possible that Tyrese Haliburton could end up breaking the franchise assist record next season. And if the way he plays holds up, if the Pacers continue to emphasize him in this way, I almost think that's likely that at least the per game record, he will break the total one, Mark Jackson, being the Iron Man and playing nearly every game for several seasons in a row. And in 1997-98, when he did set that franchise record, he did play in all 82 games. That will make it harder. But I think he can definitely break the per game record, as we're seeing. He tore it up this weekend. It was the best Haliburton's looked and something the Pacers will hope to build on going forward. Some other good stuff that happened. Isaiah Jackson returned. That will be the entire next segment, but he missed some time prior to this with that concussion/head injury. Really, he played 7 minutes against the Kings, but if you don't count that game, because he got injured again and had to leave the game, he had not played since March 15th. So basically a little over 2 weeks that Isaiah Jackson not at the floor, getting close to 3 weeks. So see him back out there was good for the Pacers, obviously, as they try to get him some more minutes. And we'll talk about him next segment because he did some good stuff this weekend. But he played pretty well against Boston, played very well against Detroit. They were a huge plus with Isaiah Jackson on the floor against the Pistons. And he finished with 19 points in that game, plus 21 in a loss. It's pretty hard to do. So it was good to see him back out there and playing and seeing how he fit with some other interesting lineups that we'll talk about next segment, as well as Tyrese Haliburton is obviously very important. So good to see him back. The Pacers will hope he can play the rest of the season, both because they want to play their young guys, but also because his minutes aren't so amazing that they're going to help this team, as we saw this weekend, win any games. And we'll talk about the standings here at the end. Another good weekend for O'Shea Brissett as well. He had 17 against Boston and shot very well from 3, 4 for 7, and got to the free throw line a bunch. And then against Detroit, had an insane third quarter where he took a heat check 3 and just completely drilled it. 20 points in that game, a double-double, 10 rebounds, and 5 assists. He was awesome this weekend. And I continue to not understand what leads to his inconsistencies with this team, because his random cutting is good, his spot-up shooting has been good, his defense is good, but it's not there every single night, and that's something I would like to ask him about and figure out, because if he can be this guy he was this weekend all the time, he's a lock to be in the Pacers rotation next year. But TBD, given that he's been a little bit inconsistent. Terry Taylor had a good weekend. He started both times, which I thought was noteworthy after Kiefer Sykes got a start last week with all these injuries. 8 points against Boston. Played very well. His rebounding, obviously, a big threat. And then 15 points, 6 rebounds, including 4 offensive rebounds against Detroit, 6 for 9 from the field. And what he did in that game that I noted about Terry Taylor is he had 3 corner threes. And if Terry Taylor becomes a corner 3 guy, combined with being an insanely good offensive rebounder and very patient post presence, only at 6'5", that is a very dynamic 6'5" player that you can play at 3, 4, and 5. If he can hit those corner threes. And corner threes, obviously, one of the most valuable shots in basketball. So an impressive weekend from him. And then Goga, last guy I wanted to highlight here, was excellent against Boston. 13 points, good defense all night as well. 4 for 6 from the field, hit all his free throws on his way to 13 points, and then was on his way to a good game against Detroit. Did not miss a shot in that game, had 2 blocks early, but re-aggravated his foot injury and didn't play in the second half. That's something to monitor down the stretch of the season, especially as Isaiah Jackson returns. So good Goga weekend, but injuries kind of derail it. So there are a lot of little things that happened well. Some bench players struggled. Dwayne Washington looked a little off. Lance had 1 good game, 1 bad game. Jalen Smith had maybe his worst game as a Pacer against Detroit. And it led to 2 Pacers losses, and that's the key takeaway for them at this point of the season is they're close to locking up their spot in the lottery. We'll talk about that in the third segment here because that's the most important thing for them standings-wise the rest of the way. But to have some positive takeaways, ultimately 2 close losses to 2 teams that have been playing better than them for the last month is a good weekend for the Pacers, even though they lost twice, which actually helps them too. So we'll get to the standing stuff, but I want to talk about Isaiah Jackson as he just returned to action and looked pretty good, and what he can mean for this team, how he looked, some interesting stat lineup stuff for him. Before we do that, though, I want to talk about the great folks over at Built Bar who are making the best tasting protein bars ever. It's the time of year that so many people have given up on their New Year's resolution here in April. A quarter of the year's gone. You might be worn out. Don't give up. Stick to your resolution, especially if it's about getting healthy, and try Built Bar to make it happen. They are delicious protein bars that are 100% covered in chocolate and basically taste like a candy bar. They have so many awesome flavors that there's something for everybody. A ton of listeners have reached out to me and told me that they absolutely love them and continue to get them and get different flavors because there's so many flavors. My favorite is the peanut butter brownie. The coconut ones are all popular. The puff variety with marshmallow infusions all popular. And again, they're all 100% covered in chocolate, low calorie, high protein, and delicious. The macros for all the health stats are right there on their website. And most of them are 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. You got to try them. Go to built.com. Use the promo code LOCKED15. You'll get 15% off your order. That promo code again is LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, go check out Locked On Now. You can hear about all the games around the NBA and latest news from our local experts, including me breaking down Pacers Pistons from the Pacers perspective. Let's talk about Isaiah Jackson. His return this weekend, obviously very noteworthy as one of the Pacers' first-round picks from last season. Duarte, as Rick Carlisle said over the weekend, probably not going to play again this season, so Isaiah Jackson is the first-round pick to watch down the stretch of the season, and he looked pretty good. So the first thing to note is the reason this all happened. Remember, he had this concussion that he suffered way back when they played Memphis on the 15th. And so he sits 2 games, and then they have a 2-game gap, and he returns against the Kings. And then he has that play where he gets beamed in the head, or that might have been against Memphis, when he got hit in the head. And that held him out again. And then against the Kings, he hit his head again and had a headache and left the game, missed 4 games with that headache. You can't really fly with like concussion symptoms and a headache, so you missed Memphis and Toronto's road trip. Whatever. He missed a lot of time. And the reason there was that gap where it looked like he could come back is he said he's stubborn, right? He wanted to play, and he got technically cleared to play, so he played, but he probably, as he admitted, should not have. So he blamed himself for rushing back from that injury before getting back in the game. So he's back now. Head's all good. Against Boston, it was his first game in a long time. Played pretty well. 6 points, 3-5 from the field. Only played 16 minutes because, again, was out for a while. But the thing in that game that stood out to me that I even tweeted this. It's rare that I tweet just something short and sweet like this. But he looked like a gazelle. He was running really well and really fast in transition. And with Tyrese Haliburton doing what he did, like we talked about in the first segment, right, that made him look really promising and good. Is that's not something he had done in a while. And then against Detroit, again, unbelievable performance from him against Detroit to shoot so well from the field, to have such an impact on defense, to be such a big plus. Like they lost by 4, and yet when Isaiah Jackson was on the floor, they were plus 21 in his 23 minutes and 26 seconds. 19 points in the end on his 8 of 10 shooting, 7 boards, 5 offensive rebounds. So springy, 2 steals, 3 blocks. He was fantastic in this game. It was really good to see him return and play so well after an extended absence. And he continues to fit pretty well with what the Pacers want to do. Because he's so fast and they want to run, he can do that. Because he's springy and quick with his rotations on defense, he can do that. I saw him this weekend switch out into perimeter players a few times and have some success, right? All the stuff that Pacers want to do. Have dynamic defense, run in transition, have vertical spacing on offense in the pick and roll. He can do all of it. And that's why I continue to want to know what he can be and how his skills can translate into this new era of the Pacers. And to see him return this weekend and look so good was great from my seat especially, and I'm sure the Pacers were thrilled to see him play so well. His defense just is so impressive to me. Like he can guard not anybody but pretty close because he's so quick and can jump so high. So it's safe to put him on basically anyone who's not really strong. He can guard, I would say 3 through 5 easily, and maybe 2 through 5. You don't want him on a 2, but if you have to switch that, whatever. And that is really helpful for a young team because switching is sometimes easier on guys who don't understand like a bunch of complex coverages or haven't played together for very long, like this crew. So he was excellent in a lot of key ways this weekend. His defense is awesome. His ability to fly around the floor and block shots and get steals and be in the passing lanes is awesome. And being a loud threat who can jump up and get offensive rebounds. Yeah, there's a lot to like about what Isaiah Jackson can do. Now, specific stuff happened this weekend that made me want to dig into some data around Isaiah Jackson. And one of them is something that I've talked about a lot with him on this podcast. And that is that when he was drafted, they did their post-draft press conference with Isaiah and Chris Duarte, and Kevin Pritchard was there. And I talked about Isaiah Jackson with him, and he said this a lot, because they had Goga and Sabonis and Turner at the time. They made it very clear. Look, Isaiah, yeah, he can play the 5, but we like him so much because we think he can play the 4. That was something that was messaged to us by Pritchard and by other, Rick Carlisle and other Pacers members, because he can defend for us. And I agree with that. I tend to subscribe to you are what you guard positionally. So if he can be a 4, that's really good. Obviously, that he can play 2 positions for the Pacers outlook, but also in the old Pacers era with their old team, that made a lot of sense. But Turner's on the team still, Goga's still on the team, Jalen Smith, who knows what his future is, right? There's a lot of opportunities for him to play with centers. And so against Boston, he played with Jalen Smith for a pretty decently long run in the second half. And those minutes went pretty well for the Pacers, and it made me want to dig up the stats. How does Isaiah Jackson look with any other center next to him? So I filtered out every minute the Pacers have played this season with Isaiah Jackson on the floor and then one of Tristan Thompson, Miles Turner, Domantas Sabonis, Goga Bitadze, or Jalen Smith next to him. Any other center. Doesn't matter which one it is. So some of this is early season stuff. Some of this is post-trade stuff. Obviously, if Tristan Thompson's in there. Some of it's very recent. Obviously, if Jalen Smith is in there. The Pacers have had Isaiah Jackson out there with another big for 118 minutes this season. And they have won those minutes by 22 points. And it's very rare to find a combination like this that is a plus for the Pacers this year because of how poor things have gone for them this season. They are the 5th worst team in the NBA. Plus 22 with any combination of 2 bigs. I thought that was fascinating. The top one at plus 13 is a lineup featuring Isaiah Jackson and Jalen Smith, also Chris Duarte, Tyrese Haliburton, and Buddy Hield in that group. I think his fit with Jalen Smith is pretty good since Jalen Smith can shoot. He had a good lineup with Goga Bitadze that's played a few times, but that top group has played 4 games together. That's a good thing for the Pacers to try to take something from. So anyway, the reason those groups have been so solid, they've conceded 240 points on 235 possessions. That's a little specific, but that is incredible. Their defensive rating with Isaiah Jackson plus a big is 102.1. That would be first in the NBA as a team by a mile. The offense is okay. 262 points on 235 possessions is about a 112 offensive rating. Yes, exactly. Basically 112. I did that in my head. For those of you listening, I'm a genius. But their offense has been solid, and it doesn't feature insane 2-point or 3-point splits. But the defense with Isaiah Jackson plus another big is very promising. That the fact that there was always the thought with Turner and Sabonis that they could get enough defense out of those two, and they couldn't. That was ultimately their biggest downfall most of the time. Isaiah Jackson plus another big, because he can guard so many positions, definitely can get more defense. Now it might be more limited offensively, but the numbers so far say, yeah, it's going to be good on defense. But what can it be on offense will be the question. And sure, that defensive regression might come eventually. There's some fluky 3-point numbers and such low numbers of minutes. Opponents are shooting 28% from 3 with Isaiah Jackson and another big out there. That will obviously climb. But so far, those numbers look good. And the eye test, especially against Boston, with him and Smith, that made me look it up. It looked pretty good together. The other lineup that is obviously worth tracking for this season and next season and forever and ever, Isaiah Jackson plus Tyrese Haliburton. Those two just fit so well together. The speed, the screening, the vertical spacing, allowing for lobs because Haliburton's such a good passer. They both defend well enough in the pick and roll because they're smart players who can read the game pretty well. Tracking how those two do together is impressive. And again, look, this is a little Pacers colored glasses to describe it this way. But for how terrible the team has been since the trade deadline, in 202 minutes, the Pacers are just, air quotes, just minus 12 in 200 minutes with those two on the floor together is better than they've been in general since that time. So yeah, it's a negative and it'll need work, but it's much better than what we've seen from the Pacers in general since the trade deadline. And the reason that they've been somewhat successful is insane offense. 118 offensive rating with those two guys on the floor together at the same time. They make so much sense as a pairing offensively. And then the defense requires a little bit of bulk around Haliburton, but offensively that pairing just makes so much sense. And we saw that this weekend when he returned, that combo can link up at any time. The lob is a threat that the Pacers haven't had in forever, and that allows Haliburton to do more. That allows kickouts to be easier. That keeps bigs a little bit more in the lane. So those 4-on-4 situations that coaches always talk about with spacing, those exist, but now you're getting it from an inside-out pass instead of just general spacing stuff like on one side of the floor. So it's really promising that those two can fit well together, and it might be early. And some of these stats might be fluky. That's not a lot of minutes for either group that I just brought up. but they are encouraging, and they do match. It's not like they're good lineups that don't match what you see. It makes sense intuitively that Haliburton plus Jackson would fit together. It makes sense given that Jackson's the best perimeter defender of any big they've had in a few seasons, that they could put together a good defensive group with him and another big. So those are noteworthy trends to watch with Isaiah Jackson, but I think the early returns are very promising, and the way he played this weekend, both with another big and with Tyrese Haliburton, are encouraging things for the Pacers to think about as they construct their team next season. Do they need another big, or do they not need another big because they know he can play two positions? Do they try to start him next year if Miles Turner's not on the team? Can they start him at the 4 even if Miles Turner's on the team? So he's playing with Haliburton. All of these are options that the Pacers can consider because these lineups play so well. So good to see Isaiah Jackson back. Super fun to watch. And these numbers will be stuff that I keep talking about in the offseason as the Pacers try to build their next team. And speaking of the offseason and stuff coming up, standings watch. Usually this is about the Pacers potentially making the playoffs. That is not the case this year. They are not going to make the playoffs, but it does matter where their draft pick ends up, where the Cavaliers end up, where the Rockets end up. And we've done standings watch every Monday for the last 2 weeks. This will probably be the last one, although in theory we'll do some stuff with the play-in tournament, it looks like. So let's talk about the standings, what the Pacers are hoping for this week, how things have gone for them in the last week, where things could stand with their pick situation. But before we do that, let's talk about the good folks over at betonline.net, your number one source for all your sports betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, including this week's Masters Championships odds, podcasts, and reviews for all the different leagues, including MLB, which is ramping up, and the NBA, which is headed to the playoffs this season. And BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. BetOnline.net. Head to that website today, or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline.net. BetOnline is where the game starts. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, I always suggest the team the Pacers just played, Locked On Pistons, to hear about how they, with sitting their starters half the game and signing Purdue standout Carson Edwards that day, were able to beat the Pacers in Indy, which was a big game for the Pacers. By losing that game, standings watch time, the Pacers are now locked into the top 6 in the lottery. If the Pacers win every game the rest of the season, they will have 28 wins. The Kings, currently 7th in the lotto, already have 29 wins. Pacers locked into top 6, which means even if the Pacers do win every game for the rest of the season and go past Portland in the inverse standings, and then they have horrible lottery luck where 4 teams behind them still jump over them, they'll still be 10th. And they'll be picking in the top 10. The last time they picked in the top 10 in general was 1996 when they picked Eric Dampier. The last time they picked inside the top 10, as has been well documented, was in the 1980s. I don't think that is talked about that much, that they had the 10th pick in 19. Well, Paul George was the 10th pick. Excuse me, I just messed up. 2010, they picked exactly 10 when they picked Paul George. 1996, they picked exactly 10th when they picked Eric Dampier. The last time inside the top 10 was in the 1980s when they picked George McLeod. But they are very close to having guarantee inside the top 10. And they're really, the odds, even if they're 6th, that they would fall all the way to 10th are like astronomically small. So they're probably going to have the best pick they've had in a long time this year. But they're guaranteed a top 10 pick now with this loss to the Pistons at 25th. And in general, the Rockets, we'll talk about, and the Magic, who are both tanking as teams do, they have a combined 10 losses in a row, those two teams. They have 59 losses. The Pacers' peak losses as of now is 57. So the Pacers cannot jump into the top 2 in the lottery. The Pistons and Thunder, who beat the Suns. The Thunder beat the Suns before I recorded this, and the Pistons obviously beat the Pacers. Both have 23 wins. So it is possible, in theory, that those teams with 23 wins. Detroit's max wins is 26, which is higher than the Pacers. The Thunder's max wins is 27, which is higher than the Pacers. So that is what standings watch is for the Pacers. There are 3 teams that Pacers fans care about for inverse standings at this point, and is Detroit, OKC, and Portland. The Thunder's remaining schedule, after somehow beating the Suns, they play Portland on Tuesday. Huge game for the Pacers. The Pacers obviously, I think, would prefer that the Thunder win, because then there's a chance they move up. But if the Blazers win, then the Pacers can't fall behind 5th in the inverse standings. That's sort of a win-win. That's a huge game that is still on the schedule from a Pacers perspective. The Thunder's games after that, they're all on the road against the Jazz, Lakers, and Clippers. So they're probably going to lose all those and not get to 25 wins. I would say there's no way the Pacers catch the Thunder. On the Pistons front, they have 3 more games. Home against the Mavericks, home against the Mavericks, home against the Bucks, and then at Philly is their last 3. Very tough opponents. Also unlikely to me that they would win all three of those, which would be required for them to get ahead of the Pacers. So, yes, it's possible for the Pacers to get to 4-3, but it's very, very unlikely, especially if Cade Cunningham is not playing for the Pistons, although they did just beat the Pacers specifically. So, it's looking extremely likely that the Pacers are locked into 5, especially so if Portland, who I just mentioned, beats OKC on Tuesday night, because then Portland would get their 28th win, and that is the Pacers' max wins as of right now. They would just need one loss to lock in top 5 in the lottery odds at that point. So the fact that OKC and Portland still play each other is huge for the Pacers on either side, but in general, the Pacers' range is now 3-6, and it's very likely that they finish 5, given who all the teams' remaining schedules are. And it didn't look like when they had that weekend where they beat Houston and Portland that the Pacers are going to be able to remain in the 5th spot. But the Kings are 500 in their last 10 games. They've gone 5-5. They've won 2 in a row. And the Pacers have lost 7 in a row. So since then, the Pacers have done the thing where they tank to the top pretty well, even though injuries have been a factor and not actual tanking measures made by the Pacers, sans resting Malcolm Brogdon. So Pacers now locked into 3, 4, 5, or 6 in the inverse standings. Very likely going to be 5. The other teams the Pacers care about are the Houston Rockets and the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Cavs are a little more complicated. We'll do them last. The Rockets, currently 20-59, lost 4 in a row. Their peak wins is 23, which is what Detroit and OKC have right now. And the Rockets close with the Nets, who are pushing to try to make the playoffs, the Raptors, who are pushing for seeding, and the Hawks, who are pushing for the play-in. There's no way the Rockets are going to win all 3 of those, which means the Rockets have clinched bottom 2 record in the NBA, basically. 1 loss away from that, which, when happening, would lock the Pacers into having the 31st or 32nd pick from that Houston team. Still a good pick, even if the Cavs pick doesn't convey this year. To get that for Caris LeVert plus a potential other asset is obviously very nice. But so that pick's looking like it's going to be good. It's pretty much locked into the top 2 of the second round. That will become official if the Rockets lose to the Nets on Tuesday. That one's much easier. The Cavs, much, much, much more complicated. The scariness of this thing has become out of control as Evan Mobley gets injured and Jared Allen gets injured, and they have various other odds and injuries throughout their season. The Cavs had. They've been slipping and slipping and slipping. They've won 4 of their last 10 while Chicago found a groove and even beat Cleveland last week. Toronto looks great despite losing to the Heat earlier today. So the Cavs now are not in a good spot. They have 3 games to go, and they are 2.5 games behind the Bulls and 3 games. Let me make sure I get this right. Math is really tough. 2.5 games behind the Bulls and 2.5 games, behind the Raptors. So them making the playoffs is not out of the question. The Cavs' peak wins is 46. The Bulls and Raptors both have 45, and both of those teams have 4 games to go. So the Bulls and Raptors need 2 wins to effectively eliminate the Cavs from the playoffs. And the Cavs do have the tiebreaker over both of those teams, but they would have to win out for that to even be possible. It's looking exceedingly likely. Like, if the Cavs lose twice, that's it. They're locked in the play-in. The Bulls have the Bucks, Celtics, Hornets, and Timberwolves left. Those are all good teams. It's possible the Bulls don't win another game and the Raptors could catch them. The Cavs could catch them. The Raptors, meanwhile, have a little bit easier of a schedule down the stretch of this season, right? So it is possible, I suppose, that the Cavs could still catch the Bulls, although I would say it's exceedingly unlikely. Those Raptors games, by the way, Hawks, Sixers both good, and then Rockets, Knicks, who both stink. So Raptors basically a lock for the playoffs at this point. The Cavs' only hope is the Bulls completely stumbling and the Cavs themselves winning out, and they close with the Magic, who they should beat. Then the Nets, and then the Bucks in the final weekend. Perhaps the Bucks would be sitting starters, so if the Cavs can pull off an upset against the Nets, maybe they could catch the Bulls, but it's looking very likely the Cavs will be in the play-in, which means the other factor of standings watch for Pacers fans to watch is who are their opponents going to be? How is that going to shake out? Because obviously, if you're a Pacers fan and you want that Cleveland pick to convey, the Cavs still have to make the playoffs, which means that they get through the play-in tournament. So the ideal situation is that they have 2 lives in the play-in tournament. So they need to finish 7th or 8th for that to happen. They are 1.5 games ahead of Atlanta, who's in 8th right now. They are 2.5 games ahead of both Charlotte and Brooklyn. Charlotte and Brooklyn's peak wins are 44. The Cavs only need 1 win to get there. So beating the Magic would basically lock them in to the 7-8 game, but they would still need a little bit of help there. Atlanta's peak wins are 45. So the Cavs, basically, I would say, if they beat Orlando, they're going to have 2 lives in the play-in tournament. If they can sneak that upset win against the Nets, they can still maybe make the playoffs. But if you really want to guarantee, if you're a Pacers fan and you really want to guarantee that the Cavs make the playoffs and the Pacers get this pick, you are rooting hard against the Bulls all weekend. And if you really, really want the Cavs to keep the pick, you're obviously rooting for them. But the other factor is to think, and this is my opinion, but The Nets are obviously the biggest threat in the play-in tournament. It's locked in that the teams are going to be Brooklyn, Charlotte, Atlanta, and Cleveland in some order. The Nets seem like the best team, even though they're in 10th, right? So if you are a Pacers fan, you also, beyond wanting the Cavs to get in the 7-8 game, want it to be Atlanta or Charlotte as the Cavs' opponent in the first game of those two, so that it's easier and more likely for them to ultimately make it through. A lot of wrinkles, but if you're a Pacers fan and you want the Cavs pick this season, the rooting order is obviously Cavs do well, Bulls do terrible, Raptors do terrible, Nets do terrible, and then Hornets and Hawks do fine-ish. Not good, but fine-ish. That is the rooting order. That's obviously very complicated. If you have questions about it, I'm on Twitter at TEastNBA, right below my finger if you're watching on YouTube. By the way, we hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. Thank you very much. If you want to add to that number, please go check us out there. This podcast is on Twitter at Locked On Pacers, where we'll be tracking every game in the NBA to see what the Pacers should want from the results of those games for pick purposes. It'll be great. Tomorrow is the national championship game, no NBA game. So hopefully I can have someone on who covers the Sixers to talk about how the process worked or didn't work and how that could be something the Pacers think, not doing the process, but how luck can impact team building and what the Pacers can learn from that. We'll see him having a little trouble booking someone. And after that game, the rest of this week is just, is TJ McConnell going to return? Is Justin Anderson going to resign? How did they look in the Sixers game? All that kind of stuff. So should be a lot to cover as the Pacers try to solidify their seeding this season, and other teams, obviously games all matter. So we'll break it all down here on Locked On Pacers. Hope everybody had a great weekend, and we will see you tomorrow.